Okay, good morning and welcome. For those of you that haven't seen me before, my name is Ben Church. I'm a geologist, so I gather together all of the sciences to arrive at an understanding of the way that the Earth works. And as a geologist, I worked on oil rigs for a few years, and I also taught geology for 26 years. Currently, I lead tours for American high school kids around Ireland and Scotland and Iceland, and I also lead adventure travel expeditions, more of which after we've been to the Azores. What I'm here to talk to you about today, though, is my great passion of mine, which is caving. So I'm a bit of a womble. So yesterday you have seen all the sort of shenanigans that I get up to overground. Today is the muddy malarkey that I get up to underground. If there's anybody here from Yorkshire or Derbyshire or South Wales or the Mendips, you'll probably have seen strange people with lights on their heads descending into holes in the ground in your region. Well, today you're going to find out what on earth they've been up to, the world of wonder that is beneath your feet. So if you want to find out why on earth people go caving, which many people find quite hard to understand, then this is a talk for you. So there'll be some awe, some wonder, some adrenaline, some adventure, some excitement, and a little humour as well. So I'll talk to you about how and where caves form, and how the beautiful formations, the stalactites from the ceiling and the stalagmites from the floor, how they develop. I'll talk a tiny little bit about cave biology, what lives down there, a brief history of caving, and a little bit about the development of caving equipment, which has really expanded what we are able to explore. But the main focus, of course, is why on earth people go caving. Now, I'm going to start with a quote, and I'm going to need you to listen carefully to this quote. Here we go. Let's get that started.
I am prepared to admit that this man-serpent game, with its prospect of having to lie sometimes for hours on nasty cold rock, in mud or icy water, rubbing the skin of elbows, knees and all parts of the body, is not everyone's idea of enjoyment. I am prepared to admit.
There we go. So, that was my good friend Johnny, who you might remember from yesterday's presentation. I took him paragliding near Leicester. So he was reading a quote from this guy, Norbert Casteret, who was a leading pioneer in caving, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. So he was a real adventurer, one of the first professional speleologists, people who study caves. And he liked it. And that's what he said about it. So caving is a very general term, and it includes all forms of exploration underground, really. People who refer to potholing are generally talking about caves where there's more vertical development, where you might need to abseil in and climb back out again. And if you hear anybody talking about spelunking, that's the American term. So more about why people go caving later. First of all, well, how on earth did I get started? Well, when I was little, probably about 7 or 8, I read this book, Richard Church, no relation, all about a kid exploring a cave, and I found that fascinating. And in the 70s, I visited a few show caves as a child, including Treecliff Cavern, one of the Blue John mines at Castleton in Derbyshire, and also the White Scar Cave. Then fast forward to when I was working on oil rigs. I had a bit of time on my hands, and I went on a multi-activity holiday in Derbyshire, and I later got involved with the organisation and frequently would get off a rig, go up there, instruct climbing, caving, mountain biking and so on, and then go back on the rigs. But what really grabbed me during that week was the caving, and there were a couple of people on the course who'd already been caving, and they said, we're going up to Yorkshire next week and we're going to go to White Scar Cave. And I said, fantastic, I'll come with you. So off I went to White Scar, and if you go back out of the show cave there into the wild part of the cave, absolutely superb. So that was me. I was hooked completely. Again, Johnny Elliott, my good friend, 1995, I'd taken him caving in the Forest of Dean in South Wales region. He was a bit ahead of me on the internet, and he'd discovered a caver's notice board. So I asked him, can you put an advert up on it for me? So he put up, British caver, seeks expedition, anywhere in the world considered. And I got a few hits, and some people from a New York caving club, they asked around to find out if I was any good or not. They contacted the British caving magazine, Descent, and the editor there, Chris, said, oh yeah, he's not a complete waste of time, he'll be all right. And then a few months later, I was at Schiphol Airport looking for some American cavers, found them, and off we went to the Ukraine for a fantastic 3-week caving expedition. So when we arrived, it was our host's 50th birthday, so everybody was toasting with vodka. And then at the end of the evening, Valeri goes, my American friends, now it's tradition, we must go swim. So we all stripped off and went swimming in the river, which we later discovered was about 50 miles downstream from Chernobyl. And then, obviously, when we got back to the flat, all sorts of caving shenanigans unfolded with all the sort of games that cavers played, all sorts of physical challenges. A few years later, we were invited by the Americans to go over to the States to do some caving. So I went over with a couple of good friends of mine. So it was like 3 amigos in the States. And we arrived, this guy, Chris Nicola, met us at the airport. We got into his pickup, drove 500 miles, and then went caving straight off. And we were cave digging. We were trying to break into the new passage in this cave here. I think really the local cavers were trying to pull a fast one on us. We did find some new cave, but it was a bit like caving in chocolate porridge, although when we came out, the local cavers gave it a different description. And also on that same expedition, we were in New York, and we parked up in the Bronx, and the driver took the steering wheel off and locked it up because it was quite a dodgy area. And then we're walking through a park in the Bronx, in the dark, in full caving kit, and we get into this place. This is Old Croton, which was one of the old water tunnels that was built in the mid-1800s, and for a long time supplied New York with all of its water. This guy apparently had got a car jack and jacked up this great big metal door, which gave us access, and then in we went to explore the tunnels, which was great fun. But then getting out of it, we literally clambered up to a manhole cover, waited until we couldn't hear any cars coming, opened it, shut it, and ran away. It was a bit like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So how and why do caves form? Well, in the cavers' world, geology is very simple. There's limestone and everything else, because the vast majority of caves are developed in limestones. The reason for this is that limestones are made out of calcium carbonate, primarily the mineral calcite, and that's chemically quite reactive, which means that it will dissolve when acids are around. So the caving that I've done has primarily been in Europe, but I've also done caving in the United States, in New Mexico, West Virginia, upstate New York, some caving in Malaysia, some caving in Vietnam, and I was caving in Thailand earlier this year. So, as I say, most of my caving is European caving, a huge amount in South Wales, a lot in Yorkshire, a lot in Derbyshire, half a dozen trips over to Ireland, usually in Southern Ireland near Doolin, County Clare, sometimes up north near Fermanagh. Also caving in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Ukraine I've already mentioned, and several trips to France, where they're going to the Gouffre Berger, which was for a long time one of the deepest caves in the world, more of which later. This last year I was caving near Annecy, and next year planning to go to the Dent de Crolles near Grenoble. So that'll be a big one, 8 to 10 hour through trips. So this limestone rock then, how does it form? Well, it is a sedimentary rock, and it generally forms in warm, shallow seas. And most of the caves that certainly in the UK, are developed in very old limestone, lower carboniferous limestone. This was formed around about just 320 million years ago, when Britain would have been just south of the equator. It can be organic, so it can be formed from the remains of fossil organisms. So on the left here, you've got a picture of a crinoidal limestone. On the right, though, we've got a chemically precipitated limestone. I think this is my favourite type of limestone. It's called oolitic limestone. It's called oolitic because it's made of millions of tiny spheres. So from the Greek oo for egg, look like fish eggs, and lith for stone, so an egg stone. And this rock is formed in a warm, shallow sea when you get a tiny little bit of broken shell or grit, and it's rolling backwards and forwards in the wave action zone, and tiny crystals of aragonite, a variety of calcium carbonate, will stick onto it, and it will grow a bit like, if you remember the sweet, a gobstopper. They're like tiny gobstoppers. Anybody who's ever been to the town of Bath, nearly all of the old buildings in Bath are made out of this honey-coloured stone. It's a much younger variety. It's a Jurassic limestone, but that is oolitic limestone. So next time you're there, have a look at the rock, and you'll see it's made up of these tiny spheres. So you've got these original beds, the layers of limestone being laid down, and you get quite distinct boundaries where there's a slight change in the rate of deposition or the nature of the material being deposited, and these are called bedding planes. But limestone also is a very heavily jointed rock. So during the burial, the formation of the rock, and by earth movements, we get tension fractures within the bed, the layer of rock, and these are joints typically at 90 degrees to those bedding planes. So the limestone is crisscrossed with all of these joints, best seen in places like the Burren, for example, in Southern Ireland, but also you can see expanses of limestone pavement, as it's called, like this in Yorkshire. So what happens is that the raindrops fall through the air and they combine with a bit of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So you might remember at school in science testing things with litmus paper. Now, if you blow through a straw into a glass of distilled water and then you test it with litmus paper, it will go red, which means you've made an acid. Carbon dioxide dissolved in water is an acid, carbonic acid. And it's this carbonic acid which is the prime mover in dissolving the limestone. So it will get down into those cracks, the joints in the limestone, and it will enlarge them, and eventually it will form caves. And it forms quite a distinctive type of landscape as well. This is known as karst scenery, where you have very little surface drainage. Most of the streams and rivers disappear down holes, typically known as sinkholes. And you will also have a lot of conical depressions around. And this is where below the surface there's been a cave collapse, the roof of the cave has collapsed, and some of the rock has come in from the surface. And these are very popular spots to go cave digging, and you dig down into these swallow holes and find cave deep below. So this is our karst scenery. When you're underground, you will notice that cave passages can be quite different in shape. What you're looking at here is a spectacular, what's called a phreatic cave passage. This is Bakerloo Strait in Danerogoff in South Wales, one of my favourite caves. This would have been formed when the entire passage was completely filled with water. This meant that the dissolving process was quite slow because you couldn't get more dissolving until the water had moved on and until you got fresh water there. But characteristic of passages formed completely filled with water are these very round caves. If, though, the water level drops, then you get what's known as a vadose passage. And here you've got air above the water. This means that the water tends to be flowing a little bit faster, and that means we get more aggressive and faster cave development. So we get these canyon-like passages. And it's very common in caves to have a keyhole shape, where the early part of the cave at the top is fairly rounded, and then you've got a slot at the bottom. So these keyhole passages are very common. And what will often happen is that the water table will drop as land is uplifted, and then you'll get completely dry, what we call fossil passages. I mentioned that cavers only really think about limestone, but as I mentioned earlier on the cruise, you do sometimes get other kinds of caves. For example, the lava tubes, where you get lava flowing and then on the roof of the top of the lava cools down, forms a sort of a skin, a roof if you like, and the lava continues to flow through that and then out of the tube at the end. And then if the lava stops flowing at the volcano end, it continues to flow through that tube, vacates the tube, leaving that empty space. The lava tends to be very vesicular. It's got lots of gas bubbles in it. So caving in lava tubes is a bit like crawling through a cheese grater. You don't get through a lot of knee pads in there. They're very common. You get lots in the Canary Islands and particularly in Hawaii. So I mentioned how caves form. What about the beautiful formations that we find there, what we know is called speleothems? Speleothems are formed when the water seeping through the rocks reaches an empty space. That empty space has got a lower concentration of carbon dioxide, and that means that you will get the precipitation of the calcite there. So you'll get the release of carbon dioxide into the air, you'll get water released, and then the carbon dioxide is deposited. This can happen quite quickly. You may even see small stalactites on the bottom of bridges where the concrete has started to develop little stalactites, but they're very, very flimsy. Most of the stalactites and stalagmites that you see have taken hundreds of thousands of years to form. So the stalactites hang on tight to the ceiling, and they contain the letter C for ceiling. These ones here are referred to as straws, and they're just one drop thick. A wonderful place called Cloud Chamber. They can get very big, so this is the Great Stalactite in Doolin Cave in Southern Ireland. Stalagmites contain the letter G for ground, and mites grow up. This is the Witch's Finger in Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. More about that expedition later. Occasionally you will get a stalactite and a stalagmite that will join together to form a column. This is in Ogoffinandee Cave in South Wales. We also get water flowing down gentle slopes and precipitating the calcium carbonate to form these gowers or rimstone pools. This was in France a couple of years ago. And here we've got flowstone again, forming lots of rimstone pools. This was in Vietnam. And you also get, where the water is coming through a crack, you get these sort of curtains forming too. Now, I'd like to introduce to you one of my favourite caves. This is Darren in South Wales, near Abergavenny, widely regarded as one of the toughest trips in the UK. It doesn't need a metal gate on it. The entrance is intimidating enough. It was discovered in 1957, and there was a big breakthrough in 1984, where they managed to get through into over 20 kilometres of cave. And this breakthrough was achieved by a friend of mine, Martin Farr, who is a cave diver, and he was the first person to go into Darren Cave, do a great long caving trip, and then do a dive to come out on the other side of the mountain. That's quite an impressive trip, a total distance of 5 kilometres, although that wasn't all diving. More about Martin later. So I said it's pretty hard. The entrance to it is 517 metres of what cavers call thrutching, which is awkwardly crawling, squeezing, wriggling and splashing about in this confined passage, often in about 30 centimetres of water. So quite challenging. And on part way in, you go through this thing called the Vice, which is quite intimidating. And this was called the calcite squeeze. I once went through here with a cracked rib, which was quite interesting. You can now actually do an 8-hour through trip, going in one entrance and out another. But that wasn't possible until an event which I'm about to mention. Cavers are always wondering what's beyond, and they'll dream about finding, passages measureless to man. That's what we thrive on. And by looking carefully at cave surveys, you can identify places that look like they might be a good place to dig. So here on the Langatic Escarpment, you've got two massive cave systems. You've got the Darren system and the Aganachwed, or Keyhole Cave system. And the survey reveals that there's only 22 metres between them. And myself with Martin, we were going in and doing cave digs there with the Donovan brothers, Tony and, I kid you not, Jason Donovan. They were triangular. They both worked at Tower Colliery, and they were enormous. And some of the stories that they told about the miners' strikes make your hair stand on end. But it was quite useful having people who worked at the pit because they gave us access to explosives, so we were able to crack big boulders that were in the way. Not making new passage, but unblocking existing passage. The adrenaline rush of when you move a boulder and see darkness beyond and hear an echo is amazing. It's a great thrill. Martin had this when he made his breakthrough, initial breakthrough in Darrenkilai in 1984. In 1993, he'd gone in on a trip with another cave diver, Gareth Hardman, and they'd caved for about 3 hours, and they'd got to this big pile of boulders, what's called a boulder choke, which is where there's been a collapse. And it suggests that there may be passage at the top of the big pile of boulders. But they were looking at it thinking, well, that looks a bit dodgy. We don't want to climb up there. So they stuck a crowbar in it and tied a rope onto it, went and hid around the corner and pulled. 15 minutes later, the boulders had just about stopped rolling, and they thought, well, we'll leave that for a bit. A couple of weeks later, I get a phone call, fancy going on a dig? Yeah, I'm up for that. So in I go, and we arrive at the bottom of this pile of teetering boulders, some of them the sort of size of a mini, and Martin looked at Gareth, Gareth looked at Martin, they both looked at me and said, what we need now is a climber. So off I went up this big pile, and they were hiding around the corner again, and I was chucking down the loose boulders, and I got to the top. And when you get excited, you get a lot of adrenaline. You can move things that you wouldn't normally be able to move. Well, I muscled up and moved this enormous boulder, popped up, and I was standing in a chamber that was about 4 meters wide, 6 meters high, and it was just heading off into the distance. So I shouted down, we're through, up they came, and off we went. And we explored nearly a kilometre of new cave. Nobody had ever been there before. More people have been to the moon. So that was really exciting. A few years later, 2002, one of the digs at the surface broke into our discovery, which we called Busman's Holiday, because it was a sort of a day off from digging in Aganachwyd. And it's now possible to do a through trip going in one entrance and out the other. So this was the size of the passage that we were exploring in the Busman's Holiday extension. And at the end of that first trip, I'd been underground, I don't know, 12 hours, 13 hours. I was really glad to see this. Well, I couldn't see it because actually it was dark. And I was so tired. I crawled through here and then carried on crawling for a few meters before I realized I was out. So when you do discover new passage, you document it. You record it, accurately survey it so that people can identify potential future digs. So it'll facilitate future exploration. And it's also a guide for other cavers. Another reason for that tangent of talking about Darrenkilai and that thrutching through the crawl and so on is that, yes, you can have hard caving, and most caving is not tiny little passages like that. Most of it you can walk through, your shoulders aren't even touching the sides. But the reward is the amazing formations that you find. So here we're looking at some of the formations in Darrenkilai. These are called the antlers, and they're unusual in that they're formed by water going through very small pore spaces which are controlled more by capillary action than gravity. So they stick out of the wall and they look like a load of bean sprouts sometimes. They're quite strange. My friend here is Julie, and we intended to go to another cave. She was trying to get a local cave leader's ticket. She needed a qualification, so she said, can you take me somewhere new? We went there, but the entrance was blocked. There'd been a fall, and I said, joking really, do you want to go on Darrenkilai? And she said, yeah, okay. And I thought, you sure? And she said, yeah, I'm up for it. So we went, and fair play, she was an absolute trooper. We had a great trip. But the next day, she sent me a photo and said, don't worry, I always bruise easily. I didn't have a mark on me. I was caving hard at the time, doing lots of caving, and if you're used to it, you move in a certain way with minimum impact on the cave and also minimum impact on your body. One of the very best caving experiences I've ever had was sparked by this National Geographic magazine article in March of 1991. This is about the Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico. At the time, I was a member of the Cumbran Caving Club, and we got a British Sports Council grant to support us in going on an expedition there in 1994. World-class caving. They'd been digging it up for a couple of years, broken through, and found 300 meters or so of cave. It's now 242 kilometres of cave. It's enormous, and it's a real warren. It didn't form in the way that most caves form with flowing, moving water. It was formed by water, acidic water coming up, and this acidic water was not carbonic acid, but very often sulfuric acid. So instead of the formations being calcite, many of the formations are calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. So it was a hard cave. We actually camped underground for 3 days, and that was the one occasion in my life where I really wished that I was taller, because after 3 days, my feet smelled bad. It was a very hot cave, constantly over 20 degrees, so we caved just in leggings, shorts, thin top, but knee pads and elbow pads. You can see me looking pretty sweaty there. That's before climbing up the I think it's 30-metre pitch, so over 100 feet rope climb on the way out. But the formation's truly spectacular. This is the chandelier ballroom. You also get these cave pearls where water is dripping, and but it's flowing too fast for stalagmites to grow, and you get concentric layers of calcite around a nucleus. Very beautiful. In that cave, a great deal of cave conservation. So when we were pushing new leads and finding new bits of cave, if we found something that was beautiful, we'd take our boots off, and it was what's known as a wet sock area. A simple touch, a muddy handprint, will destroy what's taken thousands of years to form. And cavers are very much of the school of, take nothing but photographs, and if you can, don't even leave any footprints. So a really special cave. And some quite colourful sections. So usually the calcite and gypsum formations are going to be white, but here you've got red, and the red is from the inclusion of iron oxides. Now, you may have gathered I live in Cornwall, and moving to Cornwall, there's no limestone. So I had to move to the dark side and start going mine exploring as well, which is a whole new ball game and a lot more Fawley Downy. But in some of the mines, particularly the copper mines, it's really colourful. You get every possible shade of green and blue. So, beautiful places. People often ask what lives in caves. Well, the constant darkness, the high humidity, not many nutrients, you've got to be pretty specialised. The most recognisable and the commonest one that we see in the UK is this lesser horseshoe bat. This isn't my photograph, I didn't take it, it's actually illegal to disturb bats. So this is one that I took from a friend of mine who's in a bat conservation group. When trekking and caving in the Malaysian jungle, went into this cave, and there were loads of bats, and we got to this little squeeze, and the guide had gone through, and he goes, "Oh, must come quick, come quick." And we went through, and we got through to the other side of this squeeze and found this, which is what they call a cave racer. It's a snake, not venomous, but its neck was like this. It just swallowed a bat. And then in France, came across these creatures, which is a proteus. So this is a sort of regressive evolution where the creatures that are well adapted to the environment start living in caves and then lose features that they don't need anymore, such as eyesight. So the history of caving kind of started with, in the UK, 1842, there was a chap called John Birkbeck, and he started exploring in Yorkshire a big hole called Gaping Gill. And he plumbed the depth of it, and he reckoned that it was pretty much 98 metres or so deep, so a good 300 foot deep. He dug a trench, a kilometre-long trench, to divert the stream, the fellbeck that was going into it, and he had himself lowered down on a rope. And he got down to a ledge at 55 metres, but the rope started to fray, so that was the end of it. But every summer, the Bradford Pothole Club, they do a winch meet, so you can be lowered down sedately on a wire cable and then get lifted out again. If we go forward to the 1880s, 1890s, a chap called Herbert Balch, he studied and explored the Wookey Hole caves in Somerset. They were actually the first UK show cave and also the location of the first cave diving. I discovered a while back that my grandfather, who is an engineer, Scottish engineer, did a lot of work on bridges in Britain, particularly in Scotland, and during the Second World War he was seconded, he was making all of the air bases and stuff like that. But I discovered that he used to dive in this kind of diving kit to inspect the legs of the bridges and stuff. And I think maybe that's where I got my adventurous streak from. So by the time we got to around about the turn of the century, we started to get the development of some caving clubs. So this here is the White Walls Club up on the Langatic. And there used to be a little glass case above the door with it, and it said Darren Keeley Rescue Kit. And there was a little toy gun in it because they didn't think anybody could ever be rescued from it. But as it happens, there was a little rockfall shortly after the breakthrough that I'd been involved with Martin and company. And I got a phone call halfway through teaching a geography lesson to a bunch of 11-year-olds and said, sorry folks, got to go, got to rescue someone from a cave, which they all thought was great. Yeah, we got the guy out and he was fine. But the French, they took the cave exploration to the next level. So we had this chap, Martel. He was kind of the father of modern speleology. And he developed techniques using ropes, using rope ladders. And he went to Gaping Gill and he actually bottomed it. He started going down on a ladder, but it wasn't long enough. So they pulled it up again. They tied 30 foot of rope to it. He clambered down the rope and then climbed down the ladder. Can you imagine how much a wet 300-foot ladder with hemp rope on the side would weigh? So caving groups grew, became very popular, particularly in the sort of the 60s. That was kind of the heyday, 60s and 70s of British caving. This is the emblem of my caving club, the Royal Forest of Dean Caving Club. Currently, there's maybe something like 4,000 or 5,000 cavers in the UK. When I first started, maybe 50,000, possibly 60. The numbers have dwindled a little, partly because of the old elfin safety putting constraints on university clubs. As far as caving kit is concerned, its development the technological advances have made caving exploration much easier. So instead of having a solid ladder, we now have these things called electron ladders with wire down the side and little aluminium rungs. But they are extremely tiring to climb. The exploration taking place in the 1950s, in particular in the Dent de Crolles, which I mentioned in France, near Grenoble, led to the development of not just the electron ladders, but also nylon ropes. And that was a huge, huge development. And it made it possible to go a lot further, particularly when the development of SRT, single rope technique, came along. So single rope technique is when you abseil down, but then you use a series of jammers to climb back up the rope. So this is the kind of device that you might use to descend the rope. On the left there, the figure of 8, the classic one. And then in the middle, the stop, which is what I use all the time. On the right is what's called a rack. Sometimes they use racks that are this big in the States, particularly in Mexico, when they're going down holes which are several hundred meters deep. So this is the kind of experience you might get if you're abseiling and climbing up the rope. You're using these kind of jammers. So they've got little teeth on them that dig into the sheath of the rope without damaging it. You can slide it up and then step up, and you repeat that movement. It looks a little bit like a frog. Probably the best way to illustrate it is with this short video. So this is how you climb a rope. So you've got one jammer attached, your chest jammer, which is really a belly button jammer, and then you've got a hand jammer. So you slide the hand jammer up, and you push down with your feet, which are in the foot loops attached to that hand jammer, and then the belly button jammer slides up. And you just repeat that motion. So this is SRT, or single rope technique. He's making it look very easy because he's got an extra twist. He's got a little jammer on his right foot, which makes the technique a little bit easier. But it is hard work, especially if I'm mineral collecting in Cornwall and I've got 25 kilos of rocks in a bag hanging off my harness. So, if you think back to that exploration of the Dent de Crolles, well, there they were exploring down to a depth of about 650 meters. This cave that I'm pictured in here was, until 1963, was the deepest cave in the world. It's the Gouffre Berger. I was lucky enough to visit that cave in the late 90s, I think it was. Brilliant trip, but you can see there, I'm almost out after an 8-hour trip. I think you can see just how absolutely exhausted I am. So, here's our friend Norbert again.
Can people really be thrilled by activities so repellent, dangerous, unhealthy, and possibly useless? Is there not beauty and variety enough under the vault of heaven?
Well,
Can
why,
people really be...
Come on. So, on to the question of why on earth people go. There are lots of misconceptions about caves and caving. Lots of people think it's all ridiculously tight and squeezy. It's not. I would say that there's maybe about, well, probably less than 5% of the caving that I do when my shoulders are touching both sides. A lot of the misconceptions are fueled by the media, who just want a good story. And you know, in particular with the whole business with the Thai rescue, they wanted it to be a good story, and they gave the impression that all caves in Vietnam are tiny, squirrely little things, and that there's lots of diving involved. But that's actually not so. And I know, I blame the media. I was caving in Thailand in the summer. I canoed through this cave. That's what most of the caves in Thailand are like, really, really big. There are plenty of caves that you can visit as a member of the public. So this is Danurogoff Cave in South Wales, and there are similar caves, you know, throughout the country, whether in the Peak District in Derbyshire or in Yorkshire or the Forest of Dean or in Ireland. Loads of places to visit. Curiosity is a big leader in caving. So this is me taking my son on his first caving trip. Well, it's not his first caving trip, because I took him underground to see Father Christmas when he wasn't even 1. But he's age 4 here, having a bit of an explore. A lot of people describe it as an out-of-this-world experience, which I think is a bit ironic, because you couldn't be more at one with being inside the world that we live in while you're caving. So this is Krubera in Russia, in Georgia, at the eastern end of the Black Sea. An enormous, enormous cave. For a while, this was the deepest cave, nearly 2.2 kilometres. There's the quest for knowledge, finding out about the archaeology of caves if you're close to the surface, the biology, the geology for me. Photography, it's a very challenging environment to take photographs, but there are fantastic opportunities to get brilliant photographs. There's scientific research, the calcite formations, the variations I mentioned in an earlier talk about how variations in oxygen isotope ratios can be used as an indicator of paleoclimates, of past climates. And indeed, this can be studied using these speleothems, the formations. It's also a personal challenge, so you're trying to push your limits each time you go caving. Fantastic for personal development. I used to teach geology, and this is my upper 6 A-level geology group having a bit of a day out, taking them caving. Absolutely superb. As I'll be talking about in my talk after we've been to the Azores about where the magic happens, caving is brilliant for stretching your comfort zone, and the work that I do underground caving in the autumn, I've got 4 courses lined up, is with an organisation called the Leadership Trust, with international groups of managers. And for all of them, it's so outside their sphere of experience, we can really break down the way that they respond to unfamiliar situations, leadership situations, teamwork situations, supporting each other, and acting under pressure, for example. So there's the adventure and the adrenaline. So this is me about to abseil down Allen Pot, which was where I showed you the video of the guy climbing up. And for me, a big motivator is the eternal search for adrenaline, and then working up a thirst in the search for the perfect pint afterwards. And then there's when you get to somewhere new and you're looking through this opening and you do not know what's the other side, you know, what amazing cave is beyond. It's fantastic for your mental health. A lot of people say, "Oh, God, you'd be mad to go caving." Well, I mean, caving's the reason why I'm not. It's a great stress buster, and it certainly got me through some of the most difficult times in my life. And you've got to be mindful. If you're prussicking or you're abseiling, you're on the lip of a big pitch, a big drop, and you're about to abseil down it, you've got to get it right. It's a great social activity as well. It's a kind of subculture, if you like. It's very inclusive. It's not trendy. You can't look cool in caving kit. And you can even take your gorgeous girlfriend caving. with caving techniques, there's all sorts. This chap here, I used to work with him in an outdoor shop, and he was spindly as can be, in his early 20s. And I went through this squeeze first, and he followed me through. And he goes, man, he says, you got the rib cage of a mouse. He couldn't believe that I'd got through this thing. It's quite good. But normally, I'm actually the fatometer. They put me through first, and they think, well, if he gets through, we'll all be fine. I've only really been properly stuck once in 35 years of caving. I was sort of hanging off my rib cage in a tight squeeze with my legs dangling over 10 metres of empty space, which wasn't great fun, but managed to get out of that in the end. It was not too much of a problem. Amazing I haven't made it to adulthood, really. So sometimes we do encounter water. So here we do what's called a duck, sometimes with just your mouth and your nose sticking out. And sometimes we go cave diving. This is a sump, so this is very short, where you just take a breath, pull yourself through on a rope. This is Martin in all of his outfit for cave diving. And he actually took me cave diving. You can't see, it's not a great picture, but I can see the little hint of yellow. That's the dive bottle on my side, because we were going through quite a narrow passage. People say, oh, aren't you going to get lost? You know, don't you need a piece of string? Well, if the cave's short enough to take a piece of string to the end, you don't need a piece of string. You're not going to get lost, except if you're cave diving, because your fins stir up all the mud on the way back. You can probably see no further than the end of your arm if you're lucky. But still I hear you say, oh, caving, isn't it dangerous? You know, is it not safe? Well, as long as you do what I call a dynamic risk assessment, you're fine. I wouldn't do these things if I thought I was going to hurt myself. You balance up what's the hazard, what can harm you. You look at how serious the consequences of it happening are, and then you assess how likely it is to happen, and then you act accordingly. But frankly, for me, I find that the most dangerous part of caving is driving home when you're tired. It's still a relatively safe sport, particularly with all the new equipment. As long as you pay attention to the weather forecast, if you're in an area where caves flood, for example, many of the Yorkshire caves or in Northern Ireland, it's pretty safe. And I think in the modern world, we've become far too risk averse. We're cosseted. And many people just don't make their own assessments, their own judgments about risk. And that makes us less able and less capable of making decisions about life in general. You can't remove all risk from life, and I don't think we should seek to either. I think a life without any element of risk is a lesser experience, frankly. I've seen vast underground chambers, amazing starless rivers underground, spectacular stalactites, the tiniest, most fragile crystals underground that you don't see at the surface. And I've become kind of bewitched by this incredible underground world, which so few people, normal people, ever see. So you can look at as many National Geographic films or David Attenborough programs as you like. But I've learned that if you've actually been there and you've worked so hard to get there, you just can't disentangle that experience, the journey, from the destination where you've seen the formations at the end. So in summary, caves mostly in limestone because of carbonic acid dissolving it. The speleothems, the stalactites and stalagmites, formed from calcite precipitating when the water moving through the rocks reaches an airspace. That caves are a very varied environment. They're not all wet or all dry. Some of them are vertical, some of them are horizontal, some of them have got thick thixotropic mud that pulls your boots off. Some of them have got very liquid mud. Some of them are tight, as we say, and some of them are huge. And there are still many caves to be discovered, even in the UK. So most of the mountains are being climbed, but there's still a lot to be found underground. And the technological advances in equipment have made that more and more possible. And it's relatively safe. Most dangerous bit, driving home when you're tired. So, I mentioned my next talk, sort of an evolutionary progression, if you like, from when the going gets tough, it makes a good bar story. It's all about me sharing my experience of adventure travel with young people and teaching them to safely enjoy their own adventures. But it's also a way of explaining how travel, whatever kind of travel, including cruising, is a fantastic vehicle for personal development, for developing all sorts of qualities. With the expeditions that I lead, it's young people, and I'm developing the qualities that are very desirable for university admission tutors or employers. But there are many personal qualities that I'm sure that you will be able to pick up on when I talk about these expeditions after the Azores. So I'll just leave you with the fact that, yes, I've got a book available on Amazon. Thank you for coming along. If you do have any questions, I'll be over there at the back. And if you don't catch me there, just catch me around the ship. Nothing I like better than talking about rocks, whether it's collecting them or being inside them or digging holes in them. That's my passion. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tex.
Time to move your body. If you can't get a girl, but your best friend can, it's time to move your body.